This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. I'm joined by Greg Sherman, a civics teacher at Conway Middle School in Orlando. You know, Greg, all levels of government have certain obligations and services that they're required to perform, but those obligations differ depending on whether they're at the federal, state, or local level. I'm sure that these issues of jurisdiction come up a lot with your students, so I'm sure you have a lot of questions for me. What's your first one?
Well, the first question I have is, can you explain the difference between a government obligation and a government service?
You know, that's a really good question because we often look to the government to sort of keep us healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? To educate us, to keep us healthy and to live a long life, and also to protect our financial resources. And so the question, of course, has come up, what is a service to the people and what is an obligation? Well, oftentimes when we're talking about services, we're talking about ways that the government expends money on our behalf. So they might provide for us medical care when we're elderly. They might provide for us an education up until we're 16 years old. So there are certain kinds of obligations that the government might have to protect all of us, but services might be differential based on where we are in terms of our life cycle, what our desires are from the government, etc. So let's say, for example, we're talking about, let's say that the nation was attacked, okay? The government has an obligation to protect the nation. Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution talks about the idea that even in situations where there is one of domestic violence, then the federal government has to protect the state governments. So we have the example of the National Guard being called in when it came to integrating schools in the South, and questions coming up in Little Rock, Arkansas, over whether or not the government was obligated and responsible for protecting the citizens. And of course, we know that the discussion came up over sort of which citizens. Was it the citizens of the community, or was it the citizens who were going to the school and being integrated in terms of the school? When we're talking about services, those services might be different based on where we are. So we talk about medical services, we might talk about keeping our roads safe, it might be talking about educating our children. So that's where sort of the government is expending money for the sake of particular populations, but an obligation means we're talking about applications to everyone, regardless of where they are in the life cycle, regardless of where they live, and those kinds of things.
Okay. I think about Hurricane Katrina, and I think about the delay in services to help those that were affected in Louisiana. Is this an example of the levels of government, state, local, and federal, and who was in charge of taking care of the situation?
Absolutely. In August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit, really the Gulf states, but New Orleans was hit far worse. We had sort of three levels of government working all at the same time, but not necessarily working together. We had the Mayor Ray Nagin, right? He's the mayor of New Orleans, and he was constantly looking at what services he could provide the people of New Orleans. We had the governor of Louisiana, right? She was also working at getting services to the people. And then also the federal government, we had a lot of attention paid to the Federal Emergency Management Association. We often called it FEMA. So we look at FEMA, we look at the state level government, we look at the local government, sort of who was obligated to perform what services. And in the end, one of the reasons why those services were so delayed is because of all that discussion over where the obligation was. I mean, it was a national disaster of epic proportions. And yet there were individuals who were living within state boundaries who were more affected than individuals living in other states, such as some of the western states. They weren't affected by the weather per se, but certainly when U.S. citizens are affected, people ask the question, is it the state where they live that's obligated to respond, or is it the nation in which they live that then has an obligation to respond?
Absolutely. So communication is a big problem, could be a big problem when disaster strikes.
Right. And not only communication, but again, you get to that sense of obligation. Who is obligated to provide certain services? So what does the federal government provide that might be different from the local government? And the more time you spend talking about those issues, and one might argue, well, the federal government certainly has more money to provide services than the local government, especially considering the circumstances the local government was in after Katrina. But then the local government is closest to the people, which means that the people then have the most sort of say over what the local government does. And the Constitution was designed that way so that the local government was closest to the people. And there were local governments created for that purpose. And so there was just a lot of communication difficulties that led to that delay in services that you were talking about.
Why would this topic be so important to students?
You know, this topic is so important to students because one of the fundamental benefits of taking civics is it teaches you how to be a citizen, how to function as a citizen. Now, we often look at the responsibilities of citizenship and we say, well, as long as you pay your taxes and you obey the laws and you serve on a jury when you're called, then you're fulfilling your obligations. But at the same time, imagine if you, as an individual citizen, didn't trust the government. Part of what helps a person trust the government is to believe that the government is listening to you. Well, how can the government listen if you're not communicating with that government in a way that's appropriate for that particular issue that you have? Therefore, it's important from a civic engagement perspective to know, what does the local government do? What does the state government do? What does the federal government do? And therefore, if I have a problem that I want to see resolved, I need to know who's responsible so that I know who to go to. So having that information helps us be better citizens, because there are obligations of citizenship, means the government decides what we do, but there's also the responsibilities of the government towards us, which is we need to hold the government responsible, but we need to hold the right level of government and the right branch of government, so we need to know who does what.
I often tell the students to think of services that they see around our community, maybe our city, our county, and the state. Mm-hmm. And I have them come up with examples, you know, like recreation parks. Mm-hmm. They like to go to the parks. Where does the funding come from for these services that they so enjoy?
Well, the funding comes from different entities depending on sort of what motivated that park to be created. So, for example, you're going to see local dollars going into maintaining parks, but there might be a state grant program that said to cities and counties, look, we have a pot of money available for beautification or recreation, and we know the parks serve both purposes, right? So we have a pot of money available for beautification or recreation, and so you need to draw up an application for this money, and some of you will get it and some of you won't. But when it comes to maintaining those parks, it might be a purely local government responsibility. Or it may be that there might be local leaders who see a piece of land somewhere, who say, you know something, there was a mayor, for example, in Orlando. We know we have Mayor Bill Frederick Park, right, in West Orlando. And they might say, well, you know, there was a mayor who, you know, he did so much service to this community when he was mayor, and he was a public servant. And so there might be local leaders who step up and lobby the local government to designate some natural areas for that particular purpose. We saw, for example, in West Orlando, there was a county commissioner. Her name was Vera Carter. And Vera Carter saw that there was an area of West Orange County, really, and the land was supposed to be designated for development. And she really believed that the way that it was going was just really not good for the community. And it motivated her, as we were talking about a minute ago, it motivated her to actually run for public office. She'd never run for public office before, and she became sort of the environmental county commissioner because she played such a key role as a commissioner in seeing to it that that particular piece of property was not developed. So here we have someone who's saying, you know, I want this area to be designated not for development. And wouldn't you know, if you go there now, there's a nice environmental resource center there. There's a nice museum there where you can see the different kinds of wildlife that live in that area. You can take tours in that area. And so we really do see how, yes, the states can designate, but so can the local governments. So what else are your students interested in besides parks and recreation?
Being able to afford college, and where will they go to college, and what kind of classes they'll take.
And it's interesting because it's at the state level that the state, provides a university system, right? And they also have certain requirements in place that students have to take certain courses no matter where they go to college in Florida in order to get a degree from a Florida accredited university, particularly one of the state universities, So they must be, I'm wondering if in 7th grade they worry about tuition costs. They might have older siblings. They might be worried about that. And they might ask the question, right, is Orlando responsible for what happens with the University of Central Florida? Certainly it's at the local level that we have discussions about what's needed in the community. So the University of Central Florida, for example, decided to sort of serve a community need by creating this medical school, right? But it had to be approved at the state level. Right? So I'm sure that your students might think about those things as well in terms of sort of, well, was that a local government decision or was that a decision made at the state level? Well, it was actually a partnership.
Right.
Yeah.
And many of them will be driving in a few years, so obviously, they hear the discussion of raising the limits of when they can get their driver's license. Would that be a local, state, or a federal involvement?
Well, it's interesting because it would really be the state makes a decision about driver's license in terms of age. So it's not like I could go from Orange County to Seminole County and be treated any differently. However, it's administered at the local level. So that means that you're going to go to a Orange County office to try to get your driver's license, if they're going to buy a car, if they're going to register their car, and the tests are given at the local level. So that means that you don't have to go to Tallahassee in order to take your driver's test. So we have to also realize that state government, even though the center of state government is in Tallahassee, that doesn't mean that all state government services are provided only in Tallahassee. We see the Department of Children and Families has local offices. We have certain environmental protection agencies at the local level, et cetera, but they really are run by the state, which means that the local government really doesn't have a say in how they, what rules they follow and what rules they don't, or in adding rules to it as well.
What if a student says, it comes up with a question of, why have a state legislative and a city government and a county government and a local government? Why not just have one set government in Tallahassee?
The Founding Fathers were so smart that way because on the one hand, they did talk about creating a state government system in Article 4, but they left it up to the states to decide what those local governments would look like. And so we see even in Florida, we have, some local governments where county commissioners are chosen countywide and some where they're chosen district-wide and some where they have a county mayor like in Orange County, but we don't have a county mayor in any other county. But what that means is that gives the opportunities for the people to have the most impact on government and to really be able to interact with their government on a more frequent basis and to have an opportunity to really interact with the government and for the government to get a sense about what are the needs in the community. And we see right now, for example, that there's a discussion about how long should early voting last, right? That's a state level decision, but it certainly affects different communities differently. And so there's discussion as to whether or not local government should have a say into how long early voting should last. Greg, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I've so much enjoyed our discussion about government obligations and government services at the federal, state, and local levels. We've been talking about these differences in obligations and services, and it's really been so interesting. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.